of our Revenue and Finance Policy hearings, and I would ask that everybody stand for our opening karakia, please. Tu tawa mai i roga, tu tawa mai i raro, tu tawa mai i roto, tu tawa mai i waho, kia tau mai te motu, te mauri ora ki te katoa, ome, ue, tāki. Thank you. Again, just a reminder that we are being recorded and live streamed. And we do have apologies from Councillor Crown, who unfortunately has had the loss of a whānau member and has had to travel away for the tangi. So do I have a mover and seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Mawson and Councillor Crystal. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. So just to, I guess, recap where we left off last Friday, obviously we did commence our deliberations and we came up with a series of scenarios that we asked council officers to model for us. So I would invite Gary to talk us through the modelling that's been completed.
All right. Thank you, Madam Mayor. So with the models that were requested, we started off with a base with the assumption of commercial at a general rate of 260%. There are also other scenarios where we had the UAGC increased to 22% plus 25% across several scenarios, and the rural residential rate decreased to 90% in a couple of scenarios as well. I also have to say that just with regards to this modelling, given that we're looking at a number of different factors, it actually makes it hard to compare apples with apples, given a number of factors. And so what I ended up doing is just breaking it down to looking at rural, residential, commercial, industrial, rural residential, and rural. So what we found with the modelling is that no particular scenario really could be considered a best fit across the different categories. And so with the discussions that we had last week, we really were looking at that base scenario, either where commercial is at 250 or 260% had the best outcome for residential. Now, given that we've got approximately 24,000 properties there, if you're looking for the greater good, then that would be more favourable. As the UAGC is increased, those properties that have a larger land value, such as the rural residential, the commercial industrial, and the rural, tend to benefit more from these. But in that space, for instance, we've got commercial industrial of approximately 1,940 properties. So if you're looking at greater good, that doesn't necessarily fit. But what we did find, and I'll just run through very briefly each scenario. So as I said, with that first scenario where we've got a commercial rate of 260% and a rural residential rate of 92.5, keeping the UAGC at 20%, that's the best outcome for residential. So we'd see over the impact would be a reduction of 1.23% in the rate. For commercial and industrial, if we've got a rural residential rate of 92.5% and the UAGC is increased to 25%, then the reduction in rates in that area would be 4.66%. For rural residential, obviously if the rural residential rate is decreased to 90%, but we stay with that high UAGC of 25%, then we see the increase in rates being 17.9%. Whereas, in that space, the worst scenario, the increase would be 20.55%. For a rural property, if the UAGC is at 25% and the rural residential rate is at 92.5%, that's the best outcome. So found an interesting relationship that the better the outcome for a rural residential property, it comes at the cost of the rural property. So we can't really find a favourable balance there. But under that scenario, we would see an increase of 14.08%. Compared to, say, rural residential at 90% and a UAGC of 20%, where the increase in rates would be at 15.27%. So it doesn't seem like much percentage-wise, but when we're looking at those larger properties with larger potential rates, the absolute amount, absolute dollar amount, there would be a bit of a variance there. We also did some modelling based on the total rates as well, because we can't just look at the general rate. There's a lot of commercial and residential properties that have targeted rates that just aren't experienced in these outlying areas. And we found essentially the same impact on those. So it was as expected in that modelling.
Thank you, Gary, for the modelling. I wonder if you could talk us through that last line in the modelling you did as well, where the rural residential was 90% and the UAGC was 25%, because that seemed, to be reasonably favourable as well.
Sure. Through you, Madam Mayor. So in that scenario, what I also did is I showed what the best outcome for each category would be, sort of by labelling it with a darker green, but what the second best outcome would be. So in that scenario, so rural residential of 90% and a UAGC of 25%. For commercial industrial, it's the second best outcome. So their best, as I said before, was 4.66% reduction. Under that, it's 4.56. So it's a 0.1 variance. For rural residential, it's the best outcome with an increase of 17.9%. And for rural, it's the second best outcome at 14.21%. However, for residential, where we've got the most properties, 24,000 properties, it's the worst outcome at a reduction in rates of 0.8%. And that's versus the best outcome of a reduction of 1.23%. So when we're looking at, say, a best fit, for 3 of the categories, it works. For one, it really doesn't.
But with the context on that general residential is still getting a decrease as an average.
That's correct. It does still receive it is still receiving a decrease, but again with the higher UAGC, given that a lot of residential properties fit into that lower land value category, it means more of the burden is shifted towards them. So they may experience a decrease, but the overall reduction is quite a bit more for those smaller properties than the larger ones. Yeah.
And I guess further to the question with the UAGC itself, the change from a 20% to 25% is quite significant. So I guess could an increase to that level be considered to be using that as a lever and smoothing, or does it essentially go beyond that?
That's a really good question. So when we are setting rates, usually one of the first 2 things we'd be looking at is the general rate as well as a combination of the targeted rate. So that the variable component of the general rate, what we'd use the differential for, to build most of what the rate may look like. And so typically with the UAGC, it will be the last lever we use, and often it's to smooth out the rate or to try and balance it a little bit more. So where we see those outliers of trying to bring it in and make it a bit more consistent. So if we look at the UAGC first and then the other parts of it, it may create more of an imbalance than is intended. So although it's, depending on the size of the property, it may not be considered much of a change, but again, it's a smaller end of the land value ranges where we're going to see the biggest increase, which is why it's usually the last part of the rating adjustment or rating calculation that we do. So the answer to that is it really does depend. It's not an easy answer, I'm afraid.
And just through the Mayor, just also noting that one of the scenarios provides for 22%, which is still a 10% movement on where you are at the moment.
Okay, I'll open up for questions. Councillor Brown.
Just it's not so much a question, just more of a statement. I just want to sort of check us on our language. We're talking about best result and greatest good for a lot of people, and the rural people did come in here and accuse us of trying to make, trying to satisfy a hope of taxpayers at their expense. And I just sort of want to check that that's, not check, but just reassure people that's not what we're doing, and this is just at the final end of things, and it's just a smoothing exercise.
So we have a lot of different factors to consider in our deliberations today, and I guess it is acknowledging that there's no perfect answer, and that we are going to have community members that are unhappy no matter where we land, and it really is about balancing all of that across a whole of our community to find what we believe is the most the best outcome that we can get for the whole of the community. And I think this is a difficult decision, and I want to acknowledge that because we have had a lot of submissions, and I know we all want to ensure that we're taking all of those, and also, where there hasn't been submissions, but that we're taking all of that into consideration and in our deliberations today. So I guess we can work through each of the scenarios one by one and ask any questions you might have in relation to them. Or if there is perhaps already one of these scenarios that we have a majority that's in support of, that we can then perhaps tease that out a little bit further. Councillor Simpson.
Might be a long table and a short breath. Through you, Madam Chair, I was the one that asked that we model the 25% UACG, and I'm actually surprised that it doesn't have a greater impact, to be honest. And certainly the last model, 90% rural residential, 25% UACG, is actually what I think answers many of the questions from our rural ratepayers, a fair rating system. And what I mean by that is all they have asked us, they haven't come in and extremely thrown up in arms and said, it's terrible, you're increasing our rates. What they have asked us to do is come back to them with a fair rating system. And when we look at that last set of modelling, it does represent, in my view, a fair apportionment of rates. There is a reduction for some, and there is still a significant increase for others. And I think that demonstrates an understanding of hearing what our rural residents have said through their submissions, and I think it actually does demonstrate a good representation of how we can demonstrate a fair rating system.
Would anyone else like to add? Yep, to that.
Sorry, could I just see? I missed the first part. You're referring to rural residential at 90 and UAGC at 25.
Yep. Madam Chair, I think the answer is really a compromise means that people at each extreme are unhappy. So if we can land somewhere in the middle, we have a good compromise.
Through you, Your Worship, I'm just interested in conversation over the second one there, which to me, as it's no one's best and no one's worst, might also strike a good balance, where rural residential is 92.5 and UAGC is 22%. Just posing the question.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Brosnan, and I guess actually they're the two scenarios that I have asterisks on my on my papers as the two that I think we probably need to tease out today and have some further questions if we would like to ask those questions, and essentially come to a position that we all believe is the best decision on behalf of the whole of our community. So I'm keen to hear everyone's views on perhaps those two scenarios in particular. Councillor Crystal, I nearly called you Deputy Mayor Brosnan.
It's in my seat.
To me, there's one missing here, the rural residential at 90 and the UAGC at 22. Because that's in between those two somewhere. That was just my question when I looked at it all.
Would it be relatively straightforward to crunch that for us, Gary?
I could, but I'll need a few minutes to be able to put it together in some sort of meaningful fashion and send it to you. But I can put it together now. But I won't be able to listen or participate, if that's okay.
That's fine, thank you. So that was rural residential at 90 and the UAGC at 22. Okay, so while Gary's working,
Was it commercial at 2?
and the commercial to remain at the
260.
260, yeah. Councillor Wright. Oh, sorry, Gary, did you have
Sorry,
a question?
Madam Mayor. Also, just with regards to the other spreadsheet that was sent through that showed the impact on the total rates, bear in mind the very first scenario was the original proposal that we did, where the commercial was at 250%, just to give you a fuller perspective on the 260% plus all those other scenarios.
Thank you. Councillor Wright.
Just if you're wanting to know where we sit at the moment, I agree that those were the two best scenarios that have been presented so far, and I concur with Councillor Simpson that the 90% rural residential and 25% UAGC is the best one put forward at the moment. Until we see these figures for this other one, that's where I sit.
Thank you. Councillor Bogue.
Considering that a higher UAGC favours higher land values, it concerns me that if we consider moving the UAGC quite dramatically, which 25% is, and the people who are going to pay more are those with the lower value properties, from what I understand. So I would stick with, I think, is the current UAGC 20% now? I think it's quite sufficient to move to 22 without going any further, because I know legally we're all right, but we didn't consult on that higher cost to residential, lower value residential properties. We heard a lot from people who have the higher value rural properties. So I just think going above 22% is a step too far for me.
Thank you, Councillor Bogue. Councillor Mawson.
In not so many words, I agree with that.
Would anyone else like to share their views while Gary frantically tries to?
I just wanted to check that when we were talking about the 90% and the 25%, that all properties still received, most properties received a decrease. It just wasn't as big a decrease as they were getting under our original proposal. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. So if you look at that final table, overall impact, the residential average decrease would be a 0.8% decrease. Recognising that that actually doesn't mean everyone would get a decrease. So, for example, under the current proposal, my personal dwelling is in the residential category, but even under the current proposal, I was getting a small increase. So, if we shifted to 90% and 25%, I'd be getting a larger increase. So I guess just while we do have a little bit of time, let's touch on some of the other changes that we'd proposed and perhaps get a final position on those if we can, and leave this till the end. So obviously the modelling that we've asked for has all been done on the basis of the commercial differential at 260%. We had consulted on 250%. However, the 260% is still lower than the current differential, which sits at 269 rounded percent. So I'd be I support the move to the 260%, and I'd be keen to hear the views around the table on that particular change. I see lots of shaking, nodding heads. Okay, great. We have also discussed a phasing in of the changed differential rates over a 3-year period. So again, wanting to know if we are seeing nodding of heads again.
Sorry,
Councillor.
Chair, I was distracted. I missed the question.
So phasing in over 3 years, so that they can, they're currently on 66%, it'll take 3 years to get to the new differential percentage.
And just a question of clarification, I believe we asked at the time whether that could be phasing in for anyone receiving a certain percentage increase, and the answer was no, it would be an equal phasing for everyone, and it would be equal over those 3 years as well, the phasing. Is that correct?
Through the Mayor, just noting that we would be recommending that all the other items other than rates be implemented from 1 July, this, depending on when the adoption date is, so that it might impact the way that we fund our activities, for example. And the other one that would recommend a full implementation would be the stormwater at the capital rate.
So essentially it's just the general rate component that we are going to be phasing in over a 3-year period, and that includes the UAGC. Yep. Councillor Price.
Just to confirm, on a previous occasion we used that period, didn't we, when we phased in a rates change?
We did. We used that when we did a transition between residential and commercial.
Sorry, just
rates.
through the Mayor, just to clarify, the UAGC would need to be implemented from year 1, we believe. So we can just seek some clarification on that, but we think just the land value transitions. The other differentials.
So the UAGC would have to be from 1 July?
I'll just seek clarification on that.
Seek some clarification. Thank you.
Can I ask a further question of clarification? There have been a number of properties that have been identified through this process and have been classified into different differentials as a result. We saw Miani Hotel as an example. Will their rates be phased for the entirety if they're changing differentials, or only if they are changed into the rural residential category?
Through the Mayor, the transition would be for everything.
Everyone.
So you need to consider it as a whole, because it's effectively, there's a plus and minus for every, change. So.
Everyone. Thank you.
Yeah.
Another area that we'd had some discussion around was the utilities differential, and potentially introducing that back in. I think based on the officer's advice that we received on that on Friday, I am actually quite comfortable with retaining that at the full commercial, leaving it in that commercial differential as was in the original proposal. So would again be keen to hear others' views on that one. So all those that think it should remain within the commercial differential, nods of heads will be fine. Perfect, thank you. Is there anything else that I haven't thought of that was up for deliberations on Friday that we sort of hadn't reached a conclusion on? Okay.
Your Worship, is there the opportunity with this phasing and when we come to this decision of signalling as part of the long-term plan the intention to investigate the change from land to capital value? And I appreciate that we don't want to confuse the LTP as been discussed, but is it a good opportunity for us to actually put that out, that that is something that we need to be considering in the future?
I think that it's absolutely a good opportunity to do that, and I don't know, Adele, if you wanted to provide any further comment on that, but I think the earlier that we can actually indicate to the community that we are looking in the future to that transition, the better.
Future consultation through the
Future consultation. That's correct. Poor Gary. No pressure.
We also had some information coming back on maybe John was providing if we could fill.
Yeah, I think so. A little bit offline. Yeah.
Sure.
So just confirming again, one of the other changes that we did fully decide on last Friday was the retention of the city water rate and sewage rate for rating units that are not connected but within the 100 or 30 metre of the system. We were going to leave it 50% as opposed to increasing to the 70% that we had proposed in the consultation document.
Five zero.
Sure, they'd be happy with that.
And that's city water and sewerage rates. Thank you.
Sure. Oh, are we discussing that one?
Well, we can open it back up for discussion. We had sort of reached a decision on Friday, but of course deliberations aren't over. So we had landed on that remaining at 50%, and that to be something that, due to the Three Waters reform that's currently underway and all the changes that are in the pipeline. Did you hear that, John? That we felt that it was appropriate to leave it at the 50% for now. Your Worship. Councillor Brown.
I'm not sure I'm 100% sold on that one yet. I feel like we're making the rates based off the information that we know today, and a lot of our other decisions are based on what we know now. We would make completely different decisions, for example, if we were going to capital gains tax, which we're also signalling would be something in the future. Capital gains tax. Capital.
You're in the wrong one. Capital versus land.
Yeah, what's the word?
A new revenue source, capital gains tax.
Capital valuations. Steve, very good. Yeah, and so I'm not sure if I am there with that rationale. If we know that it costs 70% rather than 50% to have that service running past someone's gate, I just feel like we should be putting out a fair targeted rate on what the costs actually are.
I would just challenge that we know that it's 70%, not 50%. I don't know that we would definitively know exactly what that cost was, and I don't recall that was ever the rationale that we had used for the 70% proposal. But you can correct me if I'm wrong.
That was my understanding.
Councillor McGrath.
Just through the chair. My concern was if a new subdivision opened and it ran past some older homes in the area that may have just invested in a new bore at a cost of tens of thousands of dollars, we were then going to make them pay or continue to pay this amount for a service they do not need or want. The only reason I can think it exists is to encourage people to join it. But if they're quite happy living off the grid without this, I'm not sure where it sits, or whether it could perhaps be a phased-in option as well. I don't know.
And I guess that was part of the conversation on Friday as well, that with the changes that are coming through from a regulatory perspective, we may find that there's a lot of rural property owners that will have to connect to the town supply if they are not wanting to write their own water safety plan and comply with the regulations themselves. So that again was one of the rationales for actually just leaving it at this point in time, because there is potentially some very significant changes in that space within the next 18 months. So I'm just to confirm that finally that we have a majority that an agreement that we leave the city water and sewerage rates for the non-connections but close at 50%.
I agree.
Great, thank you. Just chatting to the governance team over there, do you have an electronic version of the original officer's recommendation that you can pull up, and we could actually start making the changes directly to that? Great, thank you. Now we'll have to leave all of these top parts because that's what we are essentially will, under the revenue and financing policy, point 1 is the one that we're still currently having a look at. 2 and 3 in that category will remain unchanged. Under the rating policy, again, we're still for that top 4 and 5 we're to land on, but going on to 6.
So just noting on the semi-rural category, just change it to rural residential.
Oh, rural residential, yep, perfect.
Instead of residential other.
Are we removing the word other from the residential other? Or are we just... Yeah, sure. Do we need other in the residential other differential category, or can we just call it residential?
Through you, Madam Mayor. The residential other, so the residential is essentially the catch-all for the ones that don't fit into commercial, rural, or rural residential. So it's residential plus anything else.
Do we have anything else that would sit?
We will have situations where we may have churches or other things such as that, which would have previously fit into that miscellaneous category.
Okay. Thank you.
Worship.
Oh, here we go.
Your Worship. Could I just ask a question for clarity? So just with your last comment, Gary, could we get some confirmation that even though we shift, these are about category titles, that any of those other or miscellaneous activities or properties within our city aren't going to be charged at a residential, but they're in that category. Is that right?
through you, Madam Mayor, that's correct. So previously with the miscellaneous category, the properties were charged at a differential of 100%. But given the nature of usage, some of them may not have rates applied or be non-rateable, that sort of thing. And so that still stands. It's just that we've moved that miscellaneous into that category as well. And also just to advise you, I've emailed through the additional scenario modelling.
Thank you, Gary. Oh, yes, we could. Okay. So if everyone's had an opportunity, and I will just read it out for the benefit of any viewers that we have. So for the scenario around rural residential at 90% and a UAGC of 22%, that results in an average decrease of 1% for the residential other category, a reduction of 4.06% for commercial industrial, average increase of 18% for rural and 18% for rural residential and 14.83% for rural. So open up for people's views.
Just a question through you, Madam Mayor. So the plus and minus is plus and minus how rates are now?
No, the original proposal that we can...
Thank you.
Actually, no, sorry, it's from the... what they are now.
Which is?
No, so this is what the increase or decrease on average will be. So, for example, that residential other category, on average, those approximately 24,000 rate payers will have a decrease of 1% on the rates that they're currently paying. Bearing in mind, of course, that we've also got the revaluations which will change that. But what we're focusing on today is the impact of the changes from the revenue and finance policy. So just to provide some context, so for that rural residential category, the proposal that we consulted on was going to result in an average increase of 20.55% for that category. And under a 90% and 22% scenario, that reduces to 18%. So I'm going to actually say that for me this would be between the two last scenarios. So again, the rural residential at 90% and UAGC at either 25% or 22% is where I'm currently sitting between those two options. And I guess, Councillor Bogue, I'd be keen to hear your views. Well, I guess I know that you're uncomfortable with a UAGC of 25%. So if you had any further comments in regards to either of those scenarios.
So which two again? Sorry, we've got a
So the final two columns.
The last two columns, thank you. Well, if I can say, I stick with the 22% just because I think it's fairer. Basically, that is the one rate that everybody pays. And
so the category that benefits the most from that final scenario is the residential category at the expense of the other three differential categories.
And with that in mind, I would like to stick to the 90% rural residential and 25% UAGC. I do think it is fairer.
Councillor Brown.
I'm in favour of the final column, so the rural residential at 90% and the UAGC at 22%. I think based off the submissions that we've received, we can, in my mind, we can justify a differential of 90% for the rural residential properties based off the all of the reasons they put forward to us, the distance from town that they are, the services that they don't have outside their front door, the extra burden of living in the rural, etc., and a bit of a reflection on the fact that their property prices are a little bit higher and that vertical equity that one of the presenters talked to us about. And I think the UAGC at 22% is an appropriate amount of smoothing while still keeping to the fundamentals of the principles of what we set out to achieve in this rates review.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. Councillor McGrath?
Just going by that scenario, I'd like to have my property moved into rural residential because I'm further away from a library than some of the people in that category currently are. But apparently we can't do that. So what I'd like to do, and we keep hearing fairer, is the definition of fair is treating people equally without favouritism or discrimination. So we should perhaps throw that word round differently, in my opinion. So, yeah, I struggle when we sit here using the word fairer. And we're not allowed to do a flat rate, because that technically would be treating everyone the same. So perhaps we should use a different word, a different term than the word fair.
So just following on from that, Councillor McGrath, are you, in terms of the scenarios that we're considering at the moment, are you indicating that a 90% differential for rural residential shouldn't be considered?
Well, I think we have to work backwards from 100%. And I think we were told before we couldn't separate out too many of these other services, or who was closer and who was further away, and who had street markings and who didn't, because everyone's different within our town, within the whole picture. And I went for a drive the other day out to the hinterland, and you know there's some pluses and minuses wherever you go in the town. So I was quite happy to drop back at this stage from 100%. But there's been no maths or science produced to show us why we should. So I struggle with that. Councillor Simpson before was mentioning some of the properties out on the edge here are just residential properties with big sections. They're not producing an income. So yeah, I'm very torn with a lot of what we're talking about here. We're fighting over some scraps.
And I guess acknowledging that we all appreciate it, it's difficult, if not impossible, to actually have a mathematical calculation to establish a difference in levels of service across the different types of properties. And what we have heard, consistently through the submissions, however, is that an increase from 66% to 100% is unreasonable and unfair, and I will use the word unfair. It's a significant increase and a significant burden on those particular ratepayers. So looking at it from that perspective, the rural residential differential could be considered to be a transitional differential, and actually recognising that those properties do receive, to a certain extent, a lot of the same services as a residential other category property, and that we have indicated that we'll be consulting in approximately 3 years' time on a transition potentially from land value to capital value, and at that point in time we could also relook at the differentials and see if any changes needed to be made and consulted on at that time as well. So
Madam Chair, if I can just talk to that.
Yeah.
And again, it is about fairness. And the reason I think we have to be very careful about 100, 90, 63, is we need to take into consideration who is more likely to use the amenities that are available for the common good and are paid for through the general rate. And what I mean by that is if a person with a large rural property, which is primarily used for residential, I can guarantee they're probably busier maintaining that property than the person who is on a subdivided quarter acre in the middle of town, who is more likely to be using the amenities. So we have to be really careful about saying to the person with the large rural property, because your property is worth more value, you should pay more to access the library, the museums and the pools. And I think we have to be really careful, and that's why we need to recognise the differentials. Because it's not just access, it's also about the proportionate shift of cost per use if you have a larger land value. And while most people are pretty philanthropic about sharing social burden, I think we do have to be mindful that just because you own a large property doesn't mean you should pay $2 more every time you use the library.
Councillor Price.
Okay, I favour the 90-25. Second from the right as you look at it. I think that when we talk about fairness, it's our job as politicians to find a fair answer to the question that's been put to us. And I feel that that is fair, and that the biggest impact is from the rural, they call themselves, rural residential. And it was quite clear from the submissions, this was the unhappy group, rural residential. In actual fact, I don't think there was any submissions from anyone that was going to get a rates decrease.
Which is quite understandable.
Yeah. But making the point as to the submissions we received. So I think that option limits the impact that these people are going to have on a big rates rise. So I favour it on that grounds. Thank you.
Deputy Mayor Brosnan.
Through you, Madam Chair. I personally favour the second one in from the left. It strikes a good balance for me, which is the rural residential at 92.5 and the UAGC at 22. My thinking around that is that, you know, I don't necessarily buy the argument around proximity and access in this city. We're no more than 10 minutes away from anything. On the outskirts of the city, and I would like to acknowledge all of the submitters and the points they made, and I think 7.5% discount off what the same value property pays in town is good to show that we have listened to those submissions. We acknowledge there is a difference, and even though I believe they have the same access, even though their proximity is slightly different, that they should be rewarded with a discount off the general rate from 100% for the same property in town value to 92.5. I think that strikes the right balance. The reason I've gone with that as my preferred option with the UAGC at 22 is I am concerned if we put our UAGC at 25, we see that disproportionate benefit away from lower socioeconomic areas, but also it leaves us little room to play with in years that we do need some smoothing, and we've heard from the team that they use that as a tool at the very end of their rates to be able to get out some of those peaks and troughs. And so I'm concerned if we go to 25% that we haven't left enough room for that. So that's my preferred option at the moment.
So I'd be quite interested to hear from councillors who haven't put. Councillor Crystal, we really need to move that name thing.
I prefer the 90 and 22, the last column. The UAGC reasons the same as Deputy Mayor Bronson. I just think 25 is quite a big jump, and I've seen a lot of the workings that Gary did around that. But it's still the difference is, on the average here, the rural residential is 0.1%. So yeah, I think that it's a fair balance in between. My choice.
Thank you, Councillor Crystal. Councillor Mawson?
Bit of an issue almost going last. I support the
There's
Deputy
still a
Mayor.
few to go.
Yeah, almost. I support the Deputy Mayor on her, the person there from the left, rural residential at 92.5 and the AGC at 22. My reasoning around that is, albeit we're dealing with minute percentages here at this sort of level, but the rural, who were most of our submitters, do get a slight decrease than the 90% and 22 UAGC of roughly 0.1516. However, it is a very hard thing to do.
Oh,
Oh, the commentary?
yeah.
There's a slight difference for the rural differential, so that's why. We've had most of our submitters were rural, so just acknowledging that slightly. They get us, for the figures are so minute, but for what it's worth, they get a slight decrease.
Councillor Taylor? Everyone's going to be too scared to look at me because that's when I'm going to pick on you.
Yeah, that's right. I've listened carefully, and I've sort of taken a lot of it into consideration. I think at the end of the day, I'm going to fall on rural residential at 90 and UAGC at 25. I think the variance between 66 and our original looking at 100%, it's still a significant raising of that level. I think that the UAGC, we are actually talking about some fairly minute variances, and those services, whether they are used, it was made clear to us earlier that people have access to them. They don't actually have to be within close proximity, that the footpaths in Central City, in Taradale, the street lighting, all of those things, that burden needs to be shared fairly. So I think I'm quite comfortable. I'll plump it 90 for rural residential and UAGC 25.
Thank you. Councillor Price, had you given, I'm trying to recall who has and who hasn't.
spoke.
You went 90, 25.
Yeah.
Yes. As did Councillor Wright. Councillor Tuppening.
Tricky. Would you like the short answer or the uppy answer, Your Worship?
Short, please.
Short answer. I'll go 90-22 as the increases are inconsequential, as mentioned before, but mostly the reason why I'd look to the lower UAGC is one, because as was mentioned by our staff, it's the last mechanism available to them to use. I'd like them to have as much scope as possible going into the future. Part of this conversation is around recognising the complexity of our past and building a rating system that helps us to meet the future. So I think the 90 and the 22 for me would be a good balance to enable staff to have room to move forward in the future, given that there are rising costs. And even though there are only minute changes between the 22 and the 25, there are actually significant and minute increases coming across the board for all our residents. and we are looking at a certain level of unpredictability in the future. So I'd like as much room for either the returning council or our staff at the next review. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Tapani.
Short as I could get it.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely, Councillor Price.
Can that come down at the next review?
The UAGC?
Yeah.
It could, absolutely.
Absolutely. So that could coincide with a change in rating style.
It could.
Yeah.
Councillor Wright.
Yeah, because we're looking at the possibility of going from land value to capital value, the whole lot of everything will be back on the table at that time. And that's why I think whatever we do now is a transitional and temporary measure that will not survive beyond that review.
That's correct. Presuming, of course, when we consult, there's support for a move from land value to capital value. Councillor Simpson.
I've previously given my opinion, which is the 20% rural residential, 90%. I wish
90% 25, was that where you landed? Yeah. Councillor McGrath.
I'm 92.5 and 22, which I think is the same as the Deputy Mayor's.
Mm-hmm.
And
Councillor Brown, have I had one from you? I should be writing people's names down as I get their view.
My first option would be 90-22. My second option would be 92.5-22.
Probably heard from everybody but me.
Yes.
So I am in favour of the 90-22, and again, as has already been commented on, I think the difference between the 90-25 and 90-22 scenarios is quite small, and I'm favouring the 22 for that. The reasons that has been expressed by other councillors in regards to that is a smoothing tool and the impact that does have on a much wider community representation. So that is currently where I am sitting with that. The reason I'm not supportive of the 92.5 and 22% scenario is that, again, coming back to the rationale being that the impact of this change is so incredibly significant on a certain group of our community, and that we're introducing this new differential as a transitional differential. I don't believe that actually recognises that, because the change between what we proposed and what people submitted on being 20.55% to a reduction to 20.46% for that particular differential, I don't believe recognises at all that we're entering into a transitional phase because of the impact it's having on that particular group of ratepayers. I don't believe that reduction actually acknowledges that scenario. So just to provide some context about why I'm favouring more moving to that 90% and 22% as opposed to the 92.5 and 22.
Were you, Your Worship, interested in your line of thinking there, and just wondering if the transition over 3 years doesn't offset that in your view?
I don't believe it offsets it. I believe the two together actually work well to mitigate the effects on that group of ratepayers.
From a lower base.
Correct.
Madam
Councillor
Mayor,
Berg.
I assume we're going to be voting on this today, is it?
We are indeed.
And I wondered if we could start off with voting on the UAGC.
I think we need to look at the two together because we have modelled them as a combined. So if we start to pull them apart, it actually changes what we're looking at.
Okay.
They do need to be looked at in combination. Adele and then Councillor Wright.
Just through the Mayor, just in relation to getting advice on whether the UAGC should be phased in. The recommendation is probably not to do that because it is a set fee, and then it's easier for restrict the number of moving parts, if you like. So we've actually got that locked down, and then we can actually build on that for future years as well. So we'd prefer to not phase in the UAGC.
Okay, so on that basis, then that reinforces my view that 22% is more reasonable if the whole impact of that change is going to hit in year one. Councillor Wright.
And based on that information, I think that we should put yours as a motion in the first instance.
Happy to do that. So we've got a number of components to the officer's recommendation and the motion that we're going to be putting, but what it might actually be helpful to have a show on of hands on that particular one in the first instance, because that will likely lead to more debate if we don't have a majority, and then we can carry on moving through the whole of the recommendation before us. So I would, like to just put on the table, not formally because we'll vote on the whole thing collectively at the end, but could I have a show of hands for those who are supportive for the 4 differentials with the rural, based on some 90%, 22% scenario that's in front of us?
Your Worship, could I ask if we did the other one first, because I'm quite happy to support that if there wasn't majority support for 92.5. So that would be my second option, which I'd be more than happy to support.
I concur as well.
But if I put my suggestion and we get a majority, then that's quite it's the opposite of what you're saying, I guess. So,
but I would support that, is what I'm saying.
Great try, Deputy Mayor.
No, I'm just saying it's...
So that would mean that we'd have our residential other at 100%, commercial and industrial at 260%, rural residential at 90% and rural at 85%. And then it does sit separate in our recommendation, but the UAGC at 22%. So if I could have a show of hands of those who are supportive of that scenario. Yeah, yes, 2290. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Councillor Simpson, I can see you're pondering.
I'm happy to concede on the basis that the UAGC, that new context around the UAGC makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm happy to go with.
So 9. Okay. Well done, everyone. Really good to hear everybody's views. We all knew this was never going to be easy, this part of the debate. So I think we've worked through it really well and had an opportunity to hear everybody's views on it. And we will need to wrap some more words around our rationale for that. But I think if we work through everything that's on the officer's recommendation, and then we can do a final wrap-up at the end to provide the rationale for all the decisions, would be a good way to move forward. So point 6 there around the city water rate is actually to remain at, that's going to remain at 50%. So, yep, maintain at 50%. Just take out the to 70% percentage part and leave the balance. Yeah, perfect. And the same change to point 7. No changes to point 8 and 9. Rates remission policy.
Just through the Mayor, just going back to the resolution around stormwater, can we just note that it'll be effective from 1 July? should the whole policy be implemented
Yep.
in full.
So effective from 1 July. So in terms of the rates remission policy, there are no changes to what was included in our proposal. However, we were seeking some additional clarification within the policy around what types of properties would qualify for a remission, in particular to cover off those quite unique properties like Friends Bush. So perhaps if we just have noted in here that there'll be some amended wording in the policy to provide clarification around properties that can apply for the remission.
Through the Mayor, yes, we can note that, but also noting that we currently can provide under special circumstances, but can provide more clarity anyway. So our policy as it stands does allow for that.
That's correct. So just actually expanding on that special circumstances and properties that could apply for a remission under that clause.
Just sorry about this dumb question, but remission rebate, remission, it doesn't mean they don't pay it at all. It's just explain remission, please. What does remission actually mean in this context?
Essentially means that if a ratepayer or their property is meets a certain set of criteria, then their rates will. It is like it's not like a rebate, but it is essentially that they will not be required to pay the full amount of rates or. Yeah, so it is essentially like a discount in recognition of the unique qualities of a property. Councillor Price.
So this would assist the group on Esk Hills where they've got their big joint.
Significant natural areas and things like that.
That would help
Correct.
them. Thank you.
Gary, you look like you.
I do, Madam Mayor. It's also worth noting too that we're trying to simplify some of this wording as well because they already get protection through other parts of the Act as well. So the policy can't go against the Act, but for instance, if a property has a QE2 covenant on it, for instance, it becomes unrated, so we don't need to create policy for that. It's already in place.
Thank you, Gary. So moving on to the rates postponement policy, again, there are no changes from what was included in the original proposal. And what we do need to add into the resolution is the increase in the UAGC. So I think we'd need to go back up to the top, the revenue and financing policy section, and add in, or is it the rating policy? Which section would this need to be sitting under?
In rating. Rating?
Rating, yeah. And perhaps as directly under,
Rural.
yeah, as a new number 6. That council increase the UAGC to 22%, effective from 1 July 2021. Okay. And we would also need to add in here the 3-year phasing period for the general rate component. And then just to go up to the revenue and financing policy area, we just need to update semi-rural there to read rural residential. And I would like to also just include, and this, just let me know, Adele, if this needs to be as part of the resolution, that we do want that you will take the intent of these resolutions into the final revenue and finance policy, including the definitions, and bring back to council for adoption in case there does need to just be some tweaking to some of the words. So that gives council officers the opportunity to actually make any of those more, immaterial changes, just to make sure the wording is correct.
And through the Mayor, and that's right, and just to get the legal review, just to make sure that we are in line with what's required. So it would be good to note, because then therefore gives the officers the delegation. So if you would like to, I think you've got a resolution there maybe to read out.
Yes, so that council officers will take the intent of the resolutions into the final revenue and finance policy, including the definitions, and bring them back to council for adoption.
Sorry, just for the Mayor, can we just bring the policy back to council for adoption?
Yeah.
Just a point of, do we need to include that the phasing is by equal increments?
Yep, that provides good clarity around how that will work. Yeah.
Yeah, so with the first year being from 1 July
Yep.
2021.
So perhaps if the general rate will be phased in over
Equally.
Equally over a 3-year period. Yep. Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Your Worship. I was just wondering if I may ask a point of clarification. I just looked at my notes, and the 70% was the fixed cost for both wastewater and water supply. It may not change anything, but I just wondered if I could get that confirmed, whether I had that correct or not.
So that was relation, John, to the proposal that we increase the city water rate and sewerage rate to 70% for those rating units not connected but within a certain distance of the system, that the 70% was based on actual fixed costs that for the provision of those services within a certain distance of a property.
Through you, Madam Mayor. Is that working? It's not my understanding that the 70% is based on actual cost. It's a recognition of value to the property that they're able to easily connect to a service that is at their gate. So it's 50%.
Thank you.
Sorry, can I just make one for the change to 7, please, through the Mayor?
Yep.
That the new general rate differentials will be phased in equally. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, just before I put this to a vote, just wanting to check in with you, Adele, in terms of the rationale for all the decisions and changes we've made here. Are we happy that we have enough detail recorded around that? I'm conscious that I don't know that we have actually recorded in here around that rural residential differential being introduced as a transitional measure, and that we'll look at it again when we go out to consult on a potential change from land value to capital value. So I can put some words around that for the team to record.
I think that would be useful through the Mayor. I think that should be documented as a resolution of council to ensure that we're compliant with our 101(3)(b).
Great. So based on public feedback and with...
Sorry, can we just create this as a new resolution? So actually have it separate. Thank you. And sorry, Helen, that will also sit under the rating policy section.
The difference between community feedback and public feedback, or should we be consistent with our wording?
We can make it community. I think it's... And with consideration to section 101, 3B of the Local Government Act, the rural residential differential is introduced as a transitional differential. New sentence. Council will look to a further consultation on land/capital valuation methodology be used to assess general rates
Being used.
at a future date. And these transitional differentials can be considered again at that time. And we will also just need to provide some further rationale around the commercial and industrial change that we've made from the 250% to the 260%. And again, I think that can probably just follow on from where you've finished there. Yeah. In determining the differential general rate for commercial and industrial property the intensity of development i.e. building and surfaces surfaces. Thank you. Was considered a primary factor for establishing a higher differential when compared to other property categories. New sentence. Based on the observed property size, residential has a lower intensity of development, followed by rural residential, and then rural property. New sentence. On that basis, differentials have been set which council believes reflects the intensity of development of those property categories. New sentence. As the most common differential, residential has been set at 100%, with other differentials set at a premium or discount to that rate. So I'll just give everyone an opportunity to read through those rationales that we've provided to support the resolution as we have written before us. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask them. Councillor Mawson.
Through the Mayor, probably not, I mean, obviously we know it's going from 20% to 22%, but is it worthwhile having that wording in there, from 20% to 22%, just for clarity for the community?
Absolutely.
Just so they don't think it's going up 22%.
Yeah. Good point.
Just through the Mayor, did you want to note any reasons for that change?
I think predominantly what I've heard is that we have essentially again used that. So before we put some words around it, just to get confirmation for everybody, this again is recognition of the fact that we are wanting to smooth the effect on those most impacted ratepayers, and the UAGC is a tool available to us to do that. Yep. So
we could just add to the end of that resolution, Helen, for the purposes of smoothing the overall rates impacts on the wider community.
Increase.
Councillor Bogue.
Sorry, I have a question. Just a question, just a bit of an explanation if possible through you, Madam Mayor, the officers. What do you mean by smoothing the overall rating impacts?
So again, this is recognising that the collective changes that we've proposed have had a significant impact on a group of our community, with increases, average increases in the 20%, and some in particular being impacted even further than that. So acknowledging that we would like to transition that impact it is having on them, and that we're using the UAGC to do that.
I'd like to minimise or mitigate the rating impacts, to reduce.
We can, I think it's sort of all semantics really. So I
know,
guess
I'm just
it's
trying to get an understanding of it. That's all.
I think it is smoothing, because it's what we're trying to do is smooth it over the whole of the community. So we're wanting to, because obviously anything we do that changes the impact on one part of the community has a flow-on effect on another part of the community. So we're essentially trying to smooth that across for the wider benefit of everybody.
Sorry, Madam Mayor. Councillor Bogue. So in terms of numbers, what that would mean is that under the original proposal, there would be a greater reduction in rates for, say, residential properties. But given that rural residential and rural properties tend to have a higher land value, by increasing the UAGC, it means some of that burden which they're experiencing is shifted back a little bit. So effectively smoothing it out a little.
Okay. If there's Councillor Mawson.
Through you, Madam Mayor, just a question for Gary. That I'm just providing a little bit of clarity. Seeing that's $375, is it? So would that then $375 go up 2%?
Through you, Madam Mayor. That's correct, up to 383.
Thank you.
Okay. If there's no further questions and no further debate, I would like to put the motion, the rather long set of resolutions in front of us, and I am happy to move that from the chair, and seconded by Councillor Wright. Thank you very much. So, I feel like I need to take a huge deep breath and a bit of a sigh of relief. So, I mean, the review of this revenue and finance policy, as we all know, commenced over 3 years ago, and it did cross over an election. So I'd like to say well done to all of the new councillors who came on board partway through this process and had to get your heads around some pretty complex rating information right from day one. I think, as we said in the public meetings, we've had 14 workshops, probably totalling around 40 hours. That was just to get to the consultation stage, to go out and engage with the community. And then we initially indicated that we would do 4 weeks of consultation, which is what we're legislatively required to do. However, after some fairly fiery public meetings, because understandably those that were quite impacted by the proposed changes felt that they really wanted a good opportunity to share their views with us. So we extended the consultation period to 7 weeks. We had a total of 6 public meetings, and we sent out, in the end, communication to every ratepayer, giving them an indication of what the impact would be for them and their property. And it was great when we received 540 submissions, because it can often be difficult to encourage our community members to make a submission. So I think I was at the stage that I was just about begging people to do it at public meetings in the end, because I just felt it was so vital that people had the opportunity to provide their input. This, as I'm sure has been reflected over the course of the hearing, is an incredibly complex issue, and I think throughout the discussions, the debate and the deliberations and the engagement with our community, there has potentially it has highlighted some unintended consequences from perhaps some of the initial proposed changes, and that is why I think it was so vital that we heard from those impacted by the changes. And I really want to thank everyone who took the time to attend the public meetings, to make a submission, whether it be written or verbal, so that we could hear everything that they had to say. So I think we've actually followed a really, really robust process. I think that we have engaged with our community in an open and transparent way, and I think we have listened to the people that engaged with us throughout this consultation process. I would like to think that those who did take the time to engage do not feel that it was a futile exercise, and that by coming and talking to us, we have listened to their concerns and we have incorporated that into the resolution that we've voted on today. So from me, it's a huge thank you to all of the council officers who were involved in this process, to all of the councillors, and to all of the community who took the time to come and talk to us. So that is what I've got to say about it. Councillor Wright, did you wish to speak to the motion?
Only to agree with everything that you have said, and to once again thank our staff very much for their assistance through what has been a very challenging process. I'm really pleased that we are going to take an opportunity in the future to re-look at capital versus land values as a basis for our taking rates. I really do also want to remind us all that we were going to take a look at some point at the income that we receive as a council that's not from rates, and I think it's really important as a council that we have a look at that 49% of income that we receive towards our costs that doesn't come from rates, and how we can increase that and improve that over time to lessen the burden on ratepayers into the future. Because there's no doubt that to me, the warning signs are there that there are increasing compliance costs and increasing costs coming down the pipeline, particularly with water and a whole lot of other things that are going to impact on our community and our ratepayers, who are already under significant pressure financially. We're a low-wage economy here, high deprivation, and I want to assure our community that this council, whenever we make decisions, are acutely aware of that, and we do the very best we can to minimise those impacts on our community. But there are a lot of things coming down the pipeline that concern me, and I really think that we have to remind ourselves that every decision we make has an impact, and there is a consequence, and we need to make sure that we do the best for our community. And that's why I highlight again that we do need to look at our non-rating income. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wright. Did anyone else wish to speak to the motion? Councillor Taylor.
Yes, I suppose I acknowledge all the things that you've said and the fact that this process started some time ago with what we called stage 2 and stage 3, and new councillors came on board at the last election. I just have one slight area that's probably not going to be greatly popular, but there was one submitter who talked about us cutting our cloth to meet, and Councillor Wright has talked about a low-wage community and that the impact of rates is continuing to grow. We know that we need to increase resources in particular areas around the Three Waters. We won't have a choice, and that the resources and the cost of that is going to be considerable. So we just need to be mindful of the fact of how our organisation cuts its cloth to meet the demands that we're placing on our community as far as our wages, the size of the staff, and I know we have a very new chief executive, but to have a look at that whole process, that we are an organisation that's fit for the purpose of the size of this city.
Thank you, Councillor Taylor. Opening up for any other councillors who'd like to speak to the motion. And just to clarify for everyone that we are actually moving ahead with the adoption, well, the proposed changes as they are now without further consultation, just so we're all clear in our minds that that is the way that we're moving forward. So I will now put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Thank you very much. Well done, everybody. Yeah. Yes.
Feel free to go home.